In the last segment, we reviewed Stanley Milgram's famous experiment on punishment. Now, in this segment, we'll consider why you get the results that you do. I should maybe back up and remind you of the results. Here they are. Whoa, we backed up too far. Okay. About 60% of subjects in the experiment follow their orders to the end, which requires that they obey the experimenter in delivering the final 450 volts to what seems to them to be a lifeless body that had been previously complaining 3 times. The results are the same for just about every kind of group you can imagine. So why? Why is it that subjects do this? Well, here's a theory that Milgram considers. And this theory is very similar to H. It's very similar to the assertion that violence is part of human nature. And here's a quote from Milgram. People harbor deeply aggressive instincts continually pressing for expression. And the experiment provides institutional justification for the release of these impulses. So remember, H holds that if you remove an authority figure and a fear of punishment, people will behave violently towards one another, or most people will, in a wide range of circumstances. So the idea is get rid of the fear of punishment, get rid of the bludgeon to enforce a contract to not hurt other people, and we're just going to be at each other's throats. We have some sort of aggressive instinct that will make us behave this way, at least in a wide range of circumstances. And the secret sadist theory basically says just that. When the fear of punishment is removed because you're given institutional justification, the experimenter's telling you it's okay to harm this person, people will do it. They'll take the opportunity to let out their aggressive impulses. Well, Milgram considers the secret sadist theory, but he doesn't think it's true. So he tries to test it. He tries to test it by inventing alterations of the original experiment and conducting those. And in one alteration, what he does is he says, teachers, you're free to choose any shock level for any trial. So you don't have to go up, you don't have to go down, you don't have to start low and go high. You can just choose whatever you want. And crucially, the experimenter emphasizes to the teachers that they really are free to choose any level. So the experimenter says, look, I'm responsible for whatever happens. If you go straight to 450 volts and shock that person over and over and hear screaming, it's okay from your point of view. That is, you are not responsible at all. I am totally responsible for anything bad that happens. So the experimenter is very clear. The experimenter might even say, hey, if you want to choose the high levels, we're interested to see what happens when people do that, so feel free to. The experimenter is just very clear that the teacher can choose any shock level the teacher wants to choose. And the experimenter is very clear that the teacher will have no responsibility for anything that comes of it. So what happens in this circumstance? Well, here's the results. In one version of this experiment, and other replications are pretty similar, 3 of 40 subjects did not go beyond the lowest shock level. So they think that in order to participate in the experiment, they have to deliver some shock, but they just choose the lowest level. What about the other 37? Well, 28 of those didn't go beyond 75 volts. So we have 31 of 40 subjects, about 75% of subjects, who stop as soon as the learner protests. That is, they stop increasing the shock level as soon as there's any protest from the learner. Now remember, the experimenter has said, feel free to keep on going higher, you are not responsible. And nonetheless, the teachers stop increasing the shock level as soon as the learner protests. That is about 75%. Another 10 don't go beyond 150 volts. And that's when the learner first protests and says, like, I want this to stop, right? When the learner first loudly says, you've got to stop this. So 38 out of 40 subjects stop increasing the shock level once the learner loudly protests, despite being encouraged by the experimenter to explore the various shock levels. Now, one went to 325 volts, so continued well past when the learner protested, and another went to 450 volts, all the way to the end. What these results suggest is not that we are secret sadists. It's not that given the opportunity, when we have institutional justification, when responsibility is removed, our aggressive impulses will come out and we'll take our chance to harm others, if only, as Hobbes thought, to advance our own self-interest over them. That's not what the experimental results suggest at all. Instead, they suggest that despite having responsibility removed, we're disinclined to harm others. Most people, about 3 out of 4, stop increasing the shock level as soon as there's any protest from the other side. And the vast majority, about 38 out of 40, stop as soon as there's a serious protest. Well, that's not what you would get if we were secret sadists. So here's the argument. If the secret sadist theory were true, then the results in the variation would resemble the results in the original experiment in the following respect. Teachers would deliver very high-level shocks. You might even expect them to deliver more severe shocks because they don't have to start at the beginning. They can immediately let out their aggressive impulses by going for high-level shocks. But in fact, that's not how subjects behave. They behave exactly the opposite way, minimizing the shocks. So the secret sadist theory is false. So this is Milgram's argument against the secret sadist theory. And notice that the secret sadist theory is very much like H. Both hold that when you have a fear of punishment removed, your aggressive impulses are going to come out. But in fact, that's not what is found in the lab at all. So this raises the question, well, why in the lab, in the original version of the experiment where subjects are not free to choose their own shock levels, when they're following instructions of an experimenter, do they go all the way to the end and deliver such severe shocks? And Milgram offers what he calls the obedience theory. He says that we're inclined to obey authority, whatever the authority asks of us. So in order to test this, he modulates factors that could be relevant to obedience. So one way to modulate this is by having the experimenter be just farther away from the teacher. And when you do that, instead of having about 2/3 of subjects go to the end, that is, deliver the 450 volts 3 times, you now only have 1/3 of subjects go to the end, when the authority is removed a bit from the situation. When you have conflicting authority figures, one who says, like, go on, and another who says stop, nobody goes to the end. When you have a pure rebel, so in this circumstance, what you do is, instead of having just Teal sitting at the board, you have Teal and another teacher, Teal star, a second teacher. And that second teacher is also in cahoots with the experimenter, although the Teal thinks that the second subject is actually just another subject, and they have to agree on what they're doing. Well, in that circumstance, when you have Teal star, that second subject, rebel and say, I'm going to stop, almost every ordinary subject, person like Teal, will stop. That is, 36 out of 40 will follow the rebel. As soon as somebody says, this is wrong, we should stop, the overwhelming majority of subjects agree and they stop. When you modulate who pulls the switch, you get very different results. I think we'll skip by that one for the sake of time, but if you're interested, you can email me and I can explain. Having the learner be closer to the teacher, close to the teacher, that is emotionally close, it's somebody you know, also modulates the results. You get about a 70% refusal to go to the end when the learner is someone the teacher knows. Okay, so here's what Zinn thinks. His thinking is basically the same as Milgram's. He suggests that the experiments show something about our willingness to obey authority, but they offer no evidence of an innate drive to violence. They offer no evidence for that thesis H, that violence is part of human nature. And here's a quote he offers talking about the obedience theory now. He says that the point here is that we don't have an innate tendency towards obedience. He says their behavior was learned, not inborn. What they learned is what most people learn in modern culture: to follow orders, to do the job you are hired to do, to obey the experts in charge. So Zinn here is going beyond rejecting the secret sadist theory. He's going beyond doing what Milgram did. He's saying not only is the secret sadist theory false, and not only is the obedience theory true, but the obedience theory isn't true because we're innately obedient. It's true because our socialization makes us obedient. He continues, so it is a learned response. Always obey, do your job, and not a natural drive that caused so many of the people in Milgram's experiment to keep pulling the pain switches. What is remarkable in the Milgram experiment, given the power of duty and obedience taught to us from childhood, is not that 60% of subjects go to the end, that they obey. It's rather that so many subjects about 40% of subjects disobey, refusing to go all the way to the end. Okay, so that ends our assessment of not psychology, but rather our assessment of the Milgram experiment. Remember, the idea here is that this experiment is the paradigm experiment purporting to show that violence is part of human nature, that we'll just behave violently towards one another whenever we get the chance, whenever we don't fear punishment. And it fails to show that. And Milgram, the person who conducted the experiment, thinks it fails to show that, and Zinn too thinks it fails to show that. Now, this doesn't mean that there's no evidence from psychology that violence is part of our nature. This is just one experiment. And then the next segment, we'll look at other experiments from psychology and see if they can vindicate premise one.